In 2008, at the peak of the global financial crisis, a researcher named John Coates was sitting in a trading room on Wall Street watching something that nobody around him could explain. The traders, experienced, educated, rational professionals whose entire job was to make clear-headed decisions under pressure, were falling apart. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a pattern that Coates, who had a background in neuroscience before he moved into finance, recognized immediately. They were becoming impulsive. They were holding losing positions too long. They were abandoning strategies that had worked for years in favor of desperate, short-term bets. They were, in the language of behavioral finance, making exactly the kinds of mistakes that textbooks warn against. And they were making them at exactly the moment when the stakes were highest. Coates did not think this was a coincidence. He had a hypothesis, and the hypothesis had a name: cortisol. What Coates found when he started measuring cortisol levels in traders during the crisis was striking. Cortisol, the hormone most associated with the stress response, produced by the adrenal glands and released into the bloodstream within minutes of a perceived threat, was elevated in every trader he tested. Significantly elevated. In some cases, levels were 2, 3, 4 times higher than baseline. And the traders with the highest cortisol levels were making the worst decisions. Not because they were less intelligent, not because they cared less, but because cortisol, at high enough concentrations, does something specific and devastating to the human brain. It changes the way risk is perceived. It alters the architecture of decision-making. It makes the future feel less real and the present feel more dangerous than it actually is. This finding, published eventually in a series of papers and then in Coates's book The Hour Between Dog and Wolf, was the beginning of a line of research that has grown substantially in the years since. And what that research has revealed is something that personal finance content almost never discusses, because it sits at the intersection of biology and behavior in a way that is genuinely difficult to communicate without going into the science. But the science matters here, because if you do not understand what cortisol does to a brain making financial decisions, you cannot understand why people, smart, informed, well-intentioned people, consistently make the same catastrophic financial mistakes under pressure. You cannot understand why financial stress is self-compounding. And you cannot understand why the standard advice, just make a budget, just stick to the plan, just be rational, is not just unhelpful but is, in a very specific biological sense, asking the impossible. Let us start at the beginning. Cortisol is not a villain. It is a survival tool, and a remarkably effective one. When the brain detects a threat, a predator, a conflict, a sudden loud noise, an unexpected bill, the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which sends a signal to the adrenal glands, which release cortisol into the bloodstream within seconds. This is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it is one of the most ancient and conserved systems in vertebrate biology. Fish have it. Reptiles have it. Every mammal that has ever lived has some version of it. It is that old, and it is that important. What cortisol does in the short term is genuinely impressive. It raises blood sugar to fuel the muscles. It sharpens certain kinds of attention, specifically the kind of narrow, focused attention that is useful when you need to track a specific threat. It suppresses functions that are not immediately necessary for survival: digestion, immune response, reproductive function, long-term planning. It increases heart rate and blood pressure. It prepares the body to fight or to flee. In the environment in which this system evolved, the environment of physical threat, where the appropriate response to danger was immediate and physical, cortisol is extraordinarily useful. The problem is the environment in which most modern humans experience their most significant cortisol spikes is not the African savanna. It is the bank statement. It is the overdue notice. It is the conversation with a partner about money. It is the moment when the account balance is lower than you thought, or the market has dropped, or the business revenue is down for the third consecutive month. These are not physical threats. They do not require a physical response. But the brain does not know that. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, does not distinguish between a lion and a letter from a debt collector. Both register as danger. Both trigger the same ancient cascade, and cortisol floods the system in response to both. Here is where the story gets specifically relevant to financial decision-making. Cortisol does not just prepare the body for physical action. It also, at elevated levels, produces a set of cognitive changes that are highly specific and highly damaging in financial contexts. The first is a shift in time horizon. Research by economists Amos Nabler and Paul Zak, building on Coates's work, has shown that elevated cortisol reliably shifts decision-making toward the short term. The future becomes less real, less salient, less motivating. The present becomes consuming. This makes perfect sense as an evolutionary adaptation. When you are facing immediate physical danger, long-term planning is irrelevant. What matters is the next 5 seconds. But in financial terms, this shift is catastrophic. Almost every sound financial decision, saving, investing, avoiding impulsive purchases, building toward long-term goals, requires the ability to give appropriate weight to the future. Cortisol systematically erodes that ability. People under financial stress literally cannot think about the future with the same clarity they can when they are calm. The future shrinks. The second cognitive change is increased loss aversion. We discussed loss aversion in the previous video, the finding from Kahneman and Tversky that the pain of loss is approximately twice as powerful as the pleasure of equivalent gain. What the cortisol research adds to this is that loss aversion is not a fixed parameter. It is modulated by stress. Elevated cortisol increases the sensitivity to potential loss, making the prospect of losing money feel even more threatening than it does under baseline conditions. People under financial stress become more risk-averse, not less, as you might naively expect from someone who needs to find a way out of their situation. They become less willing to take the calculated risks that might actually improve their position. They choose the safe, the certain, the known, even when the safe and certain option is clearly suboptimal. The third cognitive change is impairment of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with executive function, long-term planning, impulse control, and rational deliberation, is exquisitely sensitive to cortisol. Research by Amy Arnson at Yale has shown that sustained high cortisol levels impair prefrontal cortical function in measurable, specific ways. Working memory is reduced. The ability to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously and reason across them is compromised. Impulse control weakens. The capacity to resist immediate temptation in favor of larger future rewards, which we know from the marshmallow experiment research is fundamental to wealth accumulation, is specifically diminished by cortisol. What this means in practice is that the people who most need good financial judgment, the people who are under the most financial stress, who are dealing with the most difficult financial circumstances, are the people whose capacity for good financial judgment has been most systematically compromised by the biology of their own stress response. This is not a moral failing. It is not a character flaw. It is a biological reality. And it has enormous implications for how we think about financial advice, financial education, and financial support systems. The fourth cognitive change is perhaps the most insidious: altered risk perception. Nadler's research, published in a landmark 2015 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that traders whose cortisol was experimentally elevated became not just more risk-averse, but more erratic in their risk assessments. Their ability to accurately perceive and evaluate risk was impaired. They saw threats that were not there. They missed opportunities because they could not distinguish between genuine risks and false alarms. Their financial decision-making became, in a very specific technical sense, noisier, more variable, less consistent, more prone to the kind of dramatic swings between overcaution and impulsivity that characterize financial decision-making under stress. This finding connects to something that financial advisors have observed for decades without being able to fully explain: that clients who are under severe financial stress make decisions that seem, from the outside, almost randomly bad. Not consistently bad in the way you might expect from someone with a particular cognitive bias, but chaotically bad. Overly cautious one day, recklessly impulsive the next, paralyzed one week, and frantically active the next. The cortisol research provides the biological explanation. When the stress response is chronically activated, risk perception becomes fundamentally unreliable. The person is not making bad decisions because they are choosing badly. They are making bad decisions because the instrument they are using to make decisions, the brain, has been biochemically altered in ways that make accurate assessment of risk and reward genuinely difficult. Now, There is a compounding dynamic here that makes financial stress uniquely vicious among the varieties of stress that people experience. Financial stress, unlike most other forms of stress, has the ability to create the very conditions that sustain and intensify it. Think about the cascade. A person experiences a financial setback, an unexpected expense, a job loss, a business downer. This triggers the stress response. Cortisol rises. The prefrontal cortex is impaired. Decision-making quality drops. The person makes worse financial decisions than they would have made under calm conditions. They avoid looking at the problem. They make impulsive purchases as a form of emotional regulation. They take on bad debt. They miss opportunities that would have required clear-headed planning to see and act on. These worse decisions worsen the financial situation. The worsened financial situation increases stress. More cortisol is produced. Decision-making quality drops further. The cycle deepens. Mullainathan and Schaffer, in their book Scarcity, called this the bandwidth tax, the cognitive cost that financial stress extracts from the mental resources available for decision-making. They estimated, based on their experimental data, that the cognitive load of financial worry is roughly equivalent to losing a night of sleep, a deficit of around 13 IQ points. This is not metaphorical. It is a measurable reduction in cognitive capacity, produced not by poverty itself, but by the experience of worrying about money. And it accumulates. People who are chronically financially stressed are operating in a state of chronic cognitive depletion, and they are making financial decisions from that depleted state, which produces outcomes that deepen the stress, which deepens the depletion, which worsens the decisions. This cycle has a name in the clinical literature, the scarcity trap. And one of its most counterintuitive features is that it affects people at all income levels. Mullainathan and Schaffer's research, which included studies of farmers in India before and after harvest, studies of shoppers at a New Jersey mall, and studies of sugarcane farmers in Brazil, found that the cognitive effects of financial stress were not simply a function of how much money people had. They were a function of how much financial worry people were experiencing relative to their available resources. A person earning 70,000 euros a year who has spent beyond their means and is 3 months behind on their mortgage can be experiencing the same kind of scarcity-induced cognitive impairment as someone living in genuine material poverty. The subjective experience of not having enough, regardless of what enough means in absolute terms, produces the same cortisol response, the same cognitive narrowing, the same impairment of exactly the decision-making capacities that would help them find a way out. There is also a gender dimension to this story that deserves mention. Research on cortisol and financial stress has consistently found differences in how men and women respond to financial threat, and these differences have implications for understanding financial behavior in couples and households. Studies by Amos Nadler and colleagues found that under conditions of financial stress, men tend to shift toward increased risk-taking, a pattern consistent with the tend and befriend versus fight-or-flight distinction in the stress response literature. Women, by contrast, tend to shift toward increased risk aversion. This divergence in stress responses can create significant conflict in couples navigating financial difficulty, because each partner's biologically mediated response to the same financial threat pushes them in opposite directions, one toward aggressive action, the other toward defensive caution, creating a dynamic that looks like a personality conflict, but is, at least in part, a difference in neurobiological stress response. John Coates, in his later research, became interested in whether there was a way to intervene in this cortisol cycle, to break it biochemically rather than purely through psychological or behavioral means. His work pointed toward the importance of physical exercise as a cortisol regulator, not as a motivational metaphor, but as a literal biochemical intervention. Sustained aerobic exercise reduces baseline cortisol levels. It increases the density of cortisol receptors in the prefrontal cortex, making that region more resilient to the cognitive effects of cortisol spikes. It promotes neuroplasticity, the growth of new neural connections, in exactly the regions most impaired by chronic stress. The research on exercise and financial decision-making is still young, but the studies that exist suggest a meaningful relationship between physical health practices and the quality of financial cognition. Sleep is even more powerfully related to cortisol regulation and financial decision-making quality. Sleep deprivation, even a single night of poor sleep, produces cortisol elevations that persist through the following day and impair prefrontal cortical function in ways that measurably worsen financial decision-making. A 2021 study from Uppsala University in Sweden found that sleep-deprived participants showed significantly increased impulsive purchasing behavior and reduced capacity for long-term financial planning compared to the same participants after a full night of sleep. The researchers used this finding to argue, provocatively, that improving sleep quality is one of the most directly effective financial interventions available, that a person who sleeps better will, as a direct consequence, make better financial decisions, independently of any changes in their financial knowledge or circumstances. The practical implications of all of this are specific enough to be actionable and different enough from standard financial advice to be worth spelling out carefully. The standard advice, make a plan, follow the plan, be disciplined, be rational, assumes a decision maker whose cognitive function is stable and reliable. The cortisol research tells us that for a large proportion of the people who most need financial help, that assumption is false. Their decision-making capacity is variable. It is highest when stress is lowest. It is most compromised when the financial situation is most dire and the stakes are highest. This suggests several things. First, that important financial decisions, the ones with long-term consequences, the ones that are difficult to reverse, should never be made in a state of acute financial stress if it can possibly be avoided. This sounds obvious. It is also, in practice, almost universally ignored. The moments when people feel most urgently that they must do something about their finances are precisely the moments when their cortisol is highest and their judgment is most compromised. Building in deliberate delays, a 24-hour rule, a 48-hour rule, a week if the decision is particularly significant, between the emotional urgency and the actual decision is not procrastination. It is cortisol management. Second, that the physical foundations of financial decision-making, sleep, exercise, nutrition, time and natural environments, social connection, are not separate from financial management. They are prerequisites for it. You cannot think clearly about money when your body is running on 3 hours of sleep and 2 cups of coffee and 2 years of unprocessed financial anxiety. The self-care framework, which financial culture tends to treat as something separate from and even in tension with financial discipline, is actually the biological substrate on which sound financial decision-making depends. Third, that financial stress needs to be treated as a medical and psychological issue as much as a practical one. The person who is paralyzed by financial anxiety, who cannot open their bank statements, who makes impulsive decisions that they know are counterproductive but cannot seem to stop making. This person does not primarily need a spreadsheet. They need their nervous system to be brought back down to a state from which rational planning is possible. That might involve therapy. It might involve medication. It might involve physical interventions. It might involve reducing the ambient level of financial threat in their life through practical means, consolidating debt, negotiating with creditors, accessing income support. But the route to better financial decisions does not begin with better financial information. It begins with a nervous system that is regulated enough to use information. The researchers who study this intersection of neuroscience and personal finance are consistent on one point: the model of the rational economic actor, the person who calmly surveys the available options, calculates the expected values, and selects the optimal choice, is not a simplification of how people behave. It is a fiction. People are not rational economic actors with occasional emotional lapses. They are biological organisms with cortisol responses and amygdalae and prefrontal cortices that interact in complex ways, and the quality of their financial decisions is not a fixed property of their intelligence or character, but a variable output of the state of their nervous system at the moment of decision. Understanding this does not excuse bad financial decisions. It does not remove personal responsibility, but it changes the nature of that responsibility. It shifts it from a moral question, "Why are you so undisciplined? Why can you not just make better choices?" to a practical one. What conditions would need to be in place for better choices to be possible, and how do you create those conditions? That is a harder question to ask and a harder problem to solve, but it is also the right question. And asking the right question is where every real solution begins. The next time you find yourself in a state of financial panic, checking your balance repeatedly, unable to sleep, making impulsive decisions that you know are wrong, frozen when you should be acting, or acting when you should be frozen. Remember that what you are experiencing is not primarily a failure of willpower or intelligence. It is a cortisol response. It is your ancient stress system doing exactly what it was built to do in an environment for which it was not designed. That knowledge will not eliminate the cortisol, but it might create enough distance between the feeling and the action for something useful to happen in the space between them. And in personal finance, as in most things that matter, the space between the feeling and the action is where everything important takes place.